It's all in your head. You don't look sick. Your tests are normal. It's probably anxiety. There's nothing wrong with you. Have you heard these words from physicians, family, and friends? If you're someone who has been struggling and swirling through the revolving door of healthcare to find answers about your health, or if you know someone who is going through this experience, then this podcast is for you. Welcome to the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast with Laura Noziga, a show dedicated to exploring the challenges of living with undiagnosed or rare medical conditions. This podcast explores both sides of the bedside. We will be speaking with patients who have had challenges with finding a diagnosis, along with experts in the field. I'm your host, Laura Noziga. Please note I am not a medical professional, nor am I affiliated with any healthcare, pharmaceutical, or device company. I am an entrepreneur, and I am an independent market researcher focused on helping healthcare organizations better understand the patient perspective. The podcast is not meant to offer medical advice, but to merely share the stories and perspectives of podcast guests. Hello, and welcome to the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast. I'm your host, Laura Noziga, and I am here today with a lovely lady, and I'm so excited to be talking with her and learning from her today. She is Suzanne Marriott, and she has a book that's about to be launched, some exciting things coming up just this coming month, or next month, actually, in June, if I've got that right. Let me tell you a little bit about Suzanne, and we'll get into some good conversation with her. So Suzanne is a memoirist. Did I say that right? Is there a better way to say it? Memoirist.
Sounds good to me.
That's a tongue twister right there. She's also a deep travel writer who shares her transformative experiences with her reader. She was her husband's caregiver for the 10 years he suffered from multiple sclerosis, and her writings on compassionate caregiving have been published in the Union newspaper's Healthy You magazine. Writer Advice awarded her the scintillating Start Prize for the first chapter of her memoir, Watching for Dragonflies, Caregiver's Transformative Journey. And that is what we will be talking about today. So, Suzanne, thanks so much for joining me.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Suzanne, of course, I want to talk about your book and everything behind it, but tell me a little bit more about you. What can you share with us about Suzanne? Tell us about Suzanne.
Well, at the time, I'm living in a co-housing community in Grass Valley, which is in the Sierra foothills
Oh,
in the historic gold mining area.
how cool. So what's fun to see there? So if I were to come visit you, what would I see?
Well, we have a wonderful state park, Empire Mines State Park. It used to be a huge gold mine here right almost in town. But unfortunately, we don't have mining going on now. We're more of a tourist area.
Mhm.
And so this is a lovely park. It has lovely grass and trees and flowers. And so that's one of the places to go. We also have historic Nevada City in addition to historic Grass Valley. So it's just two lovely towns to wander around in, lots of shops and good things to find and eat.
Yeah, eat, even better. Well, it sounds like you are enjoying yourself there. And again, I'm happy to have you with me. And we had some nice conversation prior to our interview today. And I'm looking to learning more from you. Suzanne, your book is coming out next month in June, if I have that right, June of 2023. And is this the first book that you've written? Not the first book, is it?
Well, it's the first book. I've done lots of other writings, articles, and I was a school teacher, but I ended my career as the grant proposal writer for my district.
Oh, wow.
And I've done a lot of academic writings because I've been a student just about all my life.
Uh-huh.
So I just like to write.
Yeah. Well, thank you for writing this book called Watching for Dragonflies. And I'm very intrigued by the title, of course, but certainly more so intrigued by
the premise of this book being a memoir and talking about your journey as your husband's caregiver for so long. And on this podcast, I do like to talk a lot about people having to advocate for yourselves or for themselves. But in this case, you are doing it on behalf of your husband, Michael. And I'd love for you to tell us more about Michael and your journey with him.
Well, he was diagnosed and in 2006, and over the next 10 years, he suffered from MS.
Hmm.
And actually, I had that wrong. He passed away in 2006.
I
So,
see.
yeah. So the 10 years prior to that, he was diagnosed. And so it obviously changed our life in many ways. And it was a gradual process. And we learned to adapt and handle all kinds of crises and upsets and all kinds of medical situations. But our main goal was to keep doing what we loved to do as long as we could and to modify how we did things. And we did lots and lots of modifications.
Uh-huh. I bet. I bet. Tell me more about Michael and what he is like and his spirits, and tell me about him from that standpoint.
Well, Michael is a Teamster. He drove truck. And this actually goes back to his grandfather, who was one of the original Teamsters with the horse-drawn, whatever they were drawing.
Uh-huh, uh-huh, sure.
And so he was a very intelligent person, very adroit and sharp, but he never had thoughts of doing anything but trucking and being a Teamster because his father and his grandfather had been in that profession. So when he was diagnosed and had to stop working, then he was free to develop his more creative
Mm.
side. And so I had been an English major and loved Shakespeare. So we'd been, we could do more of going to plays and other cultural events. And he was quite an artist. So he would draw in his journal. And one of the ways, the main way that he coped with having MS was by doing paintings and drawings in his big art journals. And are very representative of what he was going through.
Mhm.
But these came from an unconscious place. So he never was really interested in trying to figure out what they meant. He just would put them out there, and this gave him some satisfaction and a way of expressing how he was feeling.
Mhm. And how long ago had he been diagnosed, and what were some of his initial symptoms?
Well, initially, after we found out what was going on, we could look back and see that there were telltale signs that things weren't right, that we had been either ignoring or attributing to all kinds of things. Well, it's the way I sit in the truck. It's this, it's that, it's the other. I didn't get enough sleep. All these different things. But what he was doing was he was dragging one leg. And we had done a lot of hiking, and all of a sudden I found myself in the lead. And usually I was quite a bit behind because he was energetic. And we had been avid hikers, and we did backpacking overnights and longer, and especially up at the Stanislaus River. So once he was diagnosed, we had to sit down and just take stock of where we were and take a look at what had led up to this diagnosis.
What did you notice most, or what was kind of the aha that, oh, maybe this had been looming for a while?
Well, it was when he did collapse on the job. I was at work, and this is when I was doing grant writing. So I had a desk and a phone, and the phone rang, and it was my husband. And he said, "I'm home. I collapsed. I couldn't get into the truck. My arms and legs just wouldn't work." And of course, they wanted to call an ambulance. He refused, so typically, and he drove himself home. And I said, well, I need to come home right now. And he said, first call the doctor. So I did, and one thing led to another, and I was told to take him immediately to the ER. So I drove home and took him to the ER, and it was very soon after that we spent quite a bit of time in the ER. And actually, a neurologist did come in at that time into the ER, and that was the clue that something serious was going on here. But an appointment was made for us the next day to see his doctor. And then that evolved into going to see a neurologist because his doctor said, well, it could be MS. I don't know what this is, though. So that was a clue.
Hmm.
And when we saw the neurologist just a few days later, he diagnosed it as MS without the spinal tap because he just, from looking at Michael's symptoms, especially his intolerance of heat, which had led to his collapse because it was warm. So we had the diagnosis, and then he was set up for infusions of solumedrol, which helped immensely with his symptoms. He got some energy back, and we did several days of infusions. So this was hopeful, and we didn't know, though, what the future was going to bring at that point.
And certainly as time went on, you found yourself in more of that care partner or caregiver type of role. But after we talked last week, this wasn't the first time that you found yourself in a caregiver type of role. I think you mentioned that you were with your mom through her journey. Is that right?
Yes, actually, with both my parents. My father had been a farmer and sprayed with all kinds of toxic materials, which led to his problems, neurological mainly, but then he ended up with dementia. So I did a lot of caregiving for him, but I didn't live too close. It was about an hour away. And then when my mother was older after my father had died, I've placed her in a boarded care setting and looked after her. And she eventually passed away. She was taken to the hospital with a stroke.
And so you had experiences as a primary caregiver in that situation, and now here you are in a similar scenario. What are you thinking at that point when you learn that, well, here's my new role? What goes through your mind at that point?
Well, it didn't really hit me that I was all of a sudden immediately a caregiver. I think on some level it did. But because we didn't know what the future was going to bring in the beginning, it was for both of us a process of learning. And I immediately went to our local MS Society chapter, and they had a workshop for the newly diagnosed. So we went there and learned quite a bit. And things progressed with learning and coping and accepting.
Mhm. Learning, coping, and accepting. How would you describe that part? Is that how you would describe kind of the caregiver journey, kind of the pieces that fall in line when you become this caregiver in this caregiver role?
Well, I really changed a lot over those 10 years. I developed an assertiveness and a protectiveness that I hadn't actually had with my mother or my father. And I attribute a lot of this to a master's program I had gone through in transpersonal psychology. And that gave me a lot of insights and tools to be able to respond to the situation I found myself in. And Michael and I hadn't always had a perfect relationship. We loved each other very much, but there were times when we had our arguments and power struggles. So when I realized how ill he was, I began to take a look at that and realized I had to be more responsive and less reactive. So I did a lot of work on my own reactivity. And as I changed, Michael changed too. And we had a more collegial type of relationship, which was very necessary because we worked together to meet the challenges that MS presented.
Mhm. What's your experience as you're going through this journey? What's going through your mind in terms of how you would describe your interactions with the healthcare system, with physicians, with other clinicians?
Well, originally we found our HMO was very responsive and wonderful to work with, but there were times when this wasn't the case. And that's when my newfound assertiveness came into play. I can go over some of those times if you would like.
Sure. Yes, please.
Well, the one that comes to mind first is he was in the hospital and he had been hospitalized many, many times as we progressed in this journey. And I was as much as possible with him in the hospital, a lot. And there was this one instance, he had been in the ICU and they had brought in a warming blanket for him. Now, this was not just your warm blanket that had been in a microwave. This was a device that had blew warm air. It was electronic and it blew warm air through this, what they called a blanket.
Uh-huh.
And so, because he was very cold at that time, because his body temperature would just fluctuate dramatically. So this helped him a great deal. And then when he was brought up to the floor, the regular hospital floor, he was cold again, and some nurses brought in this warming blanket. But they did not know how to operate it. And so this made me very uncomfortable. But as they were looking at the dials and trying to figure out how to work it, and they decided to put it on him and they would turn it up to the high setting to warm him quickly. Now I said, this has to be lowered. And they said, oh, yeah, yes. And that we're going off shift and the next shift we'll definitely lower them. We'll tell them what to do and advise them of everything. So I did leave because it was time to go and it was approaching evening. And I went home and I was concerned. So I called to make sure that he was all right and was assured that he was fine. Everything was fine. They were checked. I said, he has to be checked on frequently. His hands and arms are not working because he's so weak. So he can't press the call button. And his voice is weak. He can't call out. So it's very important that he be checked frequently. They said, oh, yes, yes, yes. So I arrived in the morning, and he is absolutely out of his mind. He keeps saying, no one will come. No one will come.
Oh, goodness.
And I realized that warming blanket had been on high all night. And I was livid. And I immediately got a cold washcloth and put it on I turned the thing off, put it on his head, and I just yelled, you get in here right now. Somebody get in here and take care of this and do something. And the nursing supervisor and two nurses came in, and to make a long story short, the nursing supervisor admonished this nurse who said, well, she was doing her paperwork. And he said, you always need to check on the patient first. I filed an official report and so forth on this.
Uh-huh.
But it was just a very, very upsetting thing. And when he got home and was lucid again, he didn't remember a thing.
Wow. Is that and it's at a certain point in life we all get into those situations with family, and so I can certainly relate to what you're saying there. And I know for myself, if I saw something that was just not right, whether it was with my grandmother or my dad, for me, I just felt this compulsion, kind of this anger that was just kind of starting to run through me. And then it came out through my mouth to say, this is wrong. This needs to be fixed. Who is your supervisor? All these things. What do you think was your tipping point that just it got you to that point where you're having to, again, like really find your voice and step up?
Well, as soon as I saw the situation, I mean, there was no stopping to think. I just reacted, actually responded appropriately. And so it was different, because I had, with my mother, I didn't have that assertiveness. And the doctors had put her on life support and intubated her and put her in the ICU. And I knew that this is not what she wanted, but I had been so used to and raised to follow what the doctor said and not question them, that I did allow that to go on. And within not too many days, she did pass away. But again, because of the program I had been through in transpersonal psychology and the work I had done in Jungian-oriented therapy and just life experience, I was able to not trust when trust wasn't inappropriate, actually.
Uh-huh.
And I do have to say this incident happened during the nursing shortage. So they did have what's called traveling nurses. Not that that's an excuse, but there were some that weren't. I think the ones that were involved weren't up to speed on that particular hospital.
Yeah. What does it take for you to have trust in a healthcare organization or a clinician?
Well, first I would have to look at their credentials, experience, and what kind of background they had as far as training. And then I would look also for doctors who can listen and don't seem to just discount what the patient says, but really listen. And I think a big fault of our system now, I guess probably because, anyway, I'm in the Medicare system, and we're limited, unless it's a special appointment, to 15 minutes with a doctor, which I just think is ridiculous. And it's rushed. And then with all the technology now, half the time the doctor has to be typing on the computer at the same time. So I think a big fault of our system right now is not enough time with doctor-patient.
Mhm. What was, if there were any situations where you really felt your concerns were dismissed? So when you had to be the voice for Michael, what kind of situation were you in where the doctor kind of, you know, kind of blew things off, or like I said, were somewhat dismissive? What's an example that you experienced?
Well, as I said, he was in and out of the hospital several times. And one of his hospital visits was very positive. He was in very bad shape, and he had, I suppose, a staph infection, all kinds of infections going on. And I had a wonderful doctor who gave him IV treatments that brought him back. He was able to go home. Well, subsequently, and I don't really remember how much long it was between the two times, but he was in another hospital in our same HMO complex or system. And he had very much the same symptoms. And he had a doctor who was treating him that I was not too confident in. And he put him on oral, he took him off the IV medications and put him on oral medications. And I just knew it was too soon for that. And I told him, I said, he had been in this other hospital that was in the system, and they treated him with IV medications that really, really helped. Would you please confer with that doctor? And I gave him the doctor's name, and he said, no, I won't.
Mm.
And I ended up firing him. I said, I'm not happy with your care, and I would like another doctor. And Michael was in bed in the hospital. This was in his room. He was not lucid. And the doctor just turned around and said, whatever you want, and walked out. And I was momentarily shocked. I thought maybe, I don't know what I thought, but for right then, he was without a doctor. So I went home and went online and I looked through all the doctors. They all have their profiles. And I found one who just looked wonderful. And I asked him if he would take charge, and he said, yes, he would.
Mm. What
And
was it about him that looked promising?
Well, he took the time to write quite a bit about his patient philosophy and about his care for patients and his ability to listen and respect for patients. And he also had a sense of humor, which came through. And
Mhm.
I always think that's a sign of higher intelligence.
Interesting. Yeah. And so yeah, the fact that a doctor could kind of keep things professional, but I guess maybe somewhat light
Hmm.
when
Hmm.
you're in
And
a situation like this and a caregiver to someone with a chronic illness. Yeah. But I think I'm going to have to include the applause track in the recording here when you said that you fired the doctor. You don't hear that too often.
yeah, well, again, I just knew what he was doing wasn't right, and my husband could have died
Mhm.
from what was going on with him. So this new doctor listened when I suggested he contact the hospital doctor from this other incidents. He had no problem doing that. He did it right away. He put him on a similar IV treatment, which he modified some. And within, I really don't know how long it was, a matter of weeks, Michael was able to come home.
Oh my gosh. What was this physician's specialty?
Well, in the system, there are just called hospital doctors.
Oh, uh-huh. Like a
So,
hospitalist.
yeah.
Yeah. Yep, yep. Understood. Suzanne, you mentioned on I think it was your website I saw that you say that caregiving is a transformative journey. Tell me about that journey with Michael. How did it transform you and or him?
Well, it transformed both of us and our relationship. Our marriage was quite different during this, and it actually improved as we learned to work together. Michael became more trusting. I became more trusting, and our intimacy really increased. And he began to know that I was there for him, that I wouldn't disappear. And I also ended up doing things that I never thought I'd be able to do. Towards the end, I was changing Foley catheters and I was administering IV medication when he came home from the hospital and just doing all kinds of things that I wouldn't have dreamt that I would be able to do.
Mm.
Also, my memoir includes probably 20 dreams. I did a lot of work with dreams. I was still going weekly to my therapist, who was very helpful. And I would bring in these dreams. And I can think of a couple where I had goddess images in my dreams,
Hmm.
which helped me become more in touch with the collaborative, collegial, compassionate, insightful aspects of myself. And then some dreams of that also helped me become more in touch with the positive, negative, and the positive masculine, because mainly when we had these fights earlier, it was the negative masculine that would come forth in me. And I'm speaking archetypal,
Sure.
the archetypal energies. And I'm not saying men are this and women are this, but archetypally, there was a negative aspects of that would just come through in a fighting mode when we were arguing. And this transformed into this assertiveness, which I just have talked about, which was a positive, powerful force. So those are just a few examples of the transformations I underwent.
What does your dream goddess look like?
Well, this particular dream, I saw her face and she had long black hair, and actually it was kind of in profile, and the hair was covered embedded within the hair were eyes.
Mm.
So there were eyes all through her hair. And this meant to me insight and ability to perceive and take in, and just in a compassionate way. She also had a aura of compassion. So compassionate insight, I would say.
Mhm. Do you kind of lean on her or kind of call to her from a spiritual standpoint?
I would say that I incorporated those aspects and came to appreciate that energy.
Mhm. Mhm. I'm curious, Suzanne, from a standpoint of your role as a caregiver, but the kind of the differences between being a caregiver for a parent versus a spouse. How would you compare the two?
Well, there were similarities, but more differences, I think, in that, well, Michael and I were peers. We worked together in a collaborative way that was pretty egalitarian. It had been that kind of marriage. With my parents, it was role reversal. Now I was in really the parental role as far as taking charge of things. For example, taking charge of their finances and paying bills and all kinds of really mundane types of things. And then just more take charge kind of thing, where with Michael, it was more working on being on the same wavelength.
Did
And
you?
also, I was very close to my mother, especially. So
Yeah.
she and I worked together a little better than I worked with my father, who wasn't. His cognitive abilities were failing, so he didn't really understand what was going on.
Yeah. When you got to the point of doing, very heavy duty caregiver, almost nursing roles, like changing catheters, etc., what's going through your mind at that point? Did you ever think that you would get to that point where you'd be doing these types of things for him?
And no, I didn't. I don't think I dwelt on the future. It was taking things more one step at a time, taking things on as they happened. And we were always looking for ways to keep doing the things we love to do. So, and Michael, even in a wheelchair, was very independent. So I didn't foresee the things that actually came into being. It was more a gradual process. And I know we were both in denial a lot. He was at a point where we should realize that death was imminent, but we didn't. Because every time in his last year, he was in the hospital perhaps 7 times. And he always would bounce back. And we'd actually go out. And once we even did some traveling. And so it was this pattern of hospitalizations and remissions. And for some reason, we just thought that would keep happening. And unfortunately, another failing of the medical system was, even though I found out in retrospect Michael had been eligible for hospice,
Hmm.
we never were directed in that. It, it didn't happen. And if it had, it would have helped a great deal, I think.
Yeah. In what way?
Well, we would have had more support, and we would have had some information that we didn't have about what to expect. So at the end, Michael was rushed to the hospital, and he wasn't in there too long before he passed away. And it was then I realized, oh my God, well, if he has a remission like he has before, we'll have to get hospice on board.
Mhm.
But it was too late for that.
Yeah. What did you do to cope with the realization that you were helping so much in terms of managing his illness, et cetera? Because it's a hefty responsibility, I guess I'll put it that way. How did you cope with that? Or what maybe were some of your outlets just for a little bit of reprieve for a while?
Well, I did have the support of my therapist. It was very helpful. I continued going to her. I also had friends who would come visit. Michael had 3 adult daughters, and they did help out some. And at one point, I hired a wonderful woman when I realized I was still working until 2002. And so I just was too worried about him when I was gone. And besides, he was a big man, 6'5", and
Oh, wow.
yeah, and
Yeah.
I couldn't do anymore. And so she was wonderful. She was helpful, and we had an overhead lift which would transport him from the bed to the wheelchair or to his shower seat. So we totally redid the bathroom so it was an open shower. So she learned to manage that. So when I was gone, she would come every morning except Sundays, and that was a great help.
So what then got you to the book? What led you to writing the book? And tell us about the book and the title again. I'm very intrigued by the
All
ti-
the time. Well, during this time, I kept journals, very detailed journals, and this was one of the ways I coped with things because I would write down what happened and that day and my feelings, and I would take these into my therapist sometimes, and we'd go over whatever was in there. And after Michael passed away, she said, if you turn these into a book or made them a basis for a book, I think it would help other caregivers. It might be a source of inspiration to others if you would share your story. And that was the impetus for my beginning to write the memoir. Now, that was 15 years before the memoir was actually published. It went through many, many revisions. I worked with developmental editors, two in particular. It changed from a focus on Michael's story to really becoming my story. And so it was a process of my having insight into my own journey and his and our marriage.
Mhm. Did you have a favorite chapter or aspect of the book that you enjoyed the most?
Well, we had a lot of fun times. We really did. And a lot of humor. So the book definitely is not a downer. It's actually an adventure in many ways. And one time you asked about the title. One time did involve dragonflies. Excuse me, I need some.
Of course, please. Are those dragonflies on your glass there? Did I see that right?
Yeah, people buy me things with.
I love it. That's fantastic. I love it.
Mm.
That the etched glass, is that what I'm seeing there?
Yes, this is from a local store in Grass
Beautiful.
Valley.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Beautiful.
I had to finally stop buying every dragon so.
Well, they're so interesting and just beautiful to watch. So I can't blame you for collecting dragonflies. But is that something that you and Michael had done
Well,
together?
Michael became the collector of dragonflies after certain incidents, and at one point we had a small RV, a Winnebago, and we went up the coast. We live in California. We went up the coast of Northern California. We lived in the San Francisco Bay Area. And at one point we stayed at a state park on the Eel River, which is way up north. And it was at that point when we went down to the river, and Michael was still using two hiking poles for stability. He was not yet in a wheelchair and never thought he would be. So we were down by the river. It was a shallow area, very slow moving, but deep enough for me to do some laps. I'd swim down with the current, no, against the current, and then let the current carry me back. So I was just going back and forth in this small area. And I noticed Michael was just standing looking at something on the other bank. And it turned out because the water was cool, and that helps with the synapses and the nerve impulses working, he was able to walk across that narrow part of the river that was so cool to the other bank without his poles. And he was standing there watching dragonflies, which were flitting among the reeds.
Oh,
And I went over and we just both stood transfixed looking at these beautiful little insects. The sun was catching their wings and just making little prisms of color.
yeah.
And I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm watching the dragonflies."
Oh,
And that became a symbol for him of a time when he could be strong, he could be on his own. He got in touch with his strength, inner and outer. So they became a very important symbol for him. And he became a collector of dragonflies, little pins and neck, little thing went around his neck. And
as
uh,
as are you now, of
so
course.
now I am a collector of dragonflies or a watcher for dragonflies. And to me, besides all the things they represented for him, they represent that his spirit is in flight and can come and visit me.
What kind of inspiration would you like to instill in people who are in caregiver roles like yourself and dealing with family or whomever that has a chronic illness or something terminal? How would you like to inspire them?
Well, one thing I learned, and I hope other people can learn, is that mistakes are inevitable. You're going to make mistakes. I made mistakes. But what I learned from those mistakes, I didn't give up. I didn't throw up my hands and say, "Oh, I'm no good. I can't do this." I need to pay attention to what went wrong and not make that mistake again. And so one of the things I would encourage other caregivers to have faith in themselves, to not get discouraged, to realize they will make mistakes and learn from them, and to be insightful, to pay attention to their own inner processes and make adjustments and be aware. And I think compassion was the thing that I developed the most in caring for Michael. Compassion for myself and compassion for his situation, his limitations as they grew. And without the compassion, I would have been doing things for Michael, but not really with him. They would be doing without being there in a compassionate way. So that's important too.
And as you said, the two of you worked together. You were partners.
Yes. Also, our trust grew and our intimacy grew in many, many ways.
Is with regard to, again, caregivers and finding their voice and advocating for their loved one, how would you suggest that they find their voice? Because there still certainly are a lot of people who are in the mindset of, well, I follow what my doctor says. And how do you get to the point of either listening to your gut or, again, finding your voice and speaking up? Because that's hard for some people to do. What kind of guidance might you give in that regard?
I'd say two things: discernment and intuition. It's pay attention and use discernment. And if you see that things are not the way they should be, trust your instincts or your intuition or your rational observations to ask questions, and if need be to intervene. It's also, I didn't do this, but I think now more commonly available are medical advocates
Oh,
who you can hire if you want to assess a situation and even do interventions for you. So that would be one thing. But I think it's still more important to find your own voice, perhaps, but perhaps not therapy, but friends or some way to get some outside help and maybe feedback. But trust your gut too.
yeah. Suzanne, with regard to your book, what are some of the key highlights that you'd want to make sure our listeners knew about to where maybe they'd want to pick up your book?
Well, I think I've gone over several of them. It does have a spiritual and psychological bent to it.
Mhm.
Also, after Michael passed away, there is some after death communication mainly through synchronicities and just a felt sense and dreams. And just so I, I think if people are interested in that aspect, they would find it interesting and hopefully inspirational.
And if I understand right, you are dealing with your own health journey, or had at one point after Michael's passing. How are you doing?
Well, I'm doing well. I do have challenges. Actually, I didn't mention that during this whole adventure with Michael, I was diagnosed with cancer. So I had my own journey, my own medical journey at that time, and again, I relied on my intuition and my felt sense. I got a lot of outside help too. I went to healers and I went to hypnotherapy and I did just everything I could think of, as well as had wonderful allopathic care. So, and actually I got into that and I forgot the question.
We were talking about your journey with cancer, as far as now you're a caregiver, and then you had your own diagnosis. How did you juggle both?
Well, fortunately, I have that wonderful woman. Her name was Una, who came more often to care for Michael. And Michael was in a wheelchair, but I was in the hospital for quite some time, and every other day, he had the energy to come visit me. He had a van with hand controls, so he could drive himself in. And so he was really my rock and support during that time. And what I came away with, I think that one of the main things I came away with was that my self-worth, my right to live, is not dependent upon doing a good job caring for Michael. I intrinsically have a right to life. And so I think my self-worth, because I came through this in many, many ways on my own and through my intuition and outside help too, it just increased my self-worth, sense of self-worth.
Yeah,
And I was alive.
and you were alive. Yeah, yeah. It's amazing how it takes these types of really heavy situations to get us to realize what we're really made of and what we're capable of and how resilient we can be. And I always like to wrap up conversations with what's the silver lining? And it sounds like you've had many. Is there one in particular that stands out, a silver lining to all that you've lived through and have experienced?
I think the main silver lining was, I would say, twofold. Michael and I did become closer, more interdependent, more trusting, and I grew in many ways, some of which I've already mentioned. So my personal growth and the increased depth and intimacy in our marriage.
Lots of blessings, lots of silver linings for sure. Well, thank you, Suzanne. I'm so appreciative of your time today. And if anyone is interested in learning more about Suzanne's journey, you can pick up her book, Watching for Dragonflies. I believe the date it's dropping is June 6th. Is that correct?
That's correct. And it's on all your usual online sites and in many, many bookstores. And if you want your bookstore to order it, it's through Ingram Pacific. I can't even think of it. Pacific Group West, something like that.
Uh-huh. Well, very good, Suzanne. All the best to you with the book. I am sure it will be successful because there's a whole generation now that's taking care of parents, of course, and still spouses or even children. And you have a lot of gifts and a lot of advice and inspiration to share. So thank you so much for being with me today.
Well, thank you for so much for having me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Oh my goodness, that's a wrap on another compelling story. Thanks for listening to the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast. If you would like more information about today's guests or to find out more about Laura, me, go to desperateforadiagnosis.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow show updates and healthcare news on the podcast's Facebook page. If you would like to be a guest on the show, or if you have any questions, advice, or suggestions for our guests, please email me at lauramarie@desperateforadiagnosis.com.